taken over a cemetery that has an amazing history. But it really is the continuation of history from an even earlier time.
Yes, we were just talking about this before we started. Hazelwood is known as the city cemetery because it is owned and operated by the city, but it is not the first city cemetery. Most people may not know because it is no longer there. The first city cemetery was on Campbell Street at State Street up to Mount Vernon Street.
Right, and all the way over to South Street.
I believe it was all the way to South
yeah.
Street, yes. And so that was the first city cemetery, and it had many names, though. It was the Citizen Cemetery, the People's Cemetery, the City Cemetery. So you'll find it in records as many different names.
They took an interesting approach to that one as far as how they took care of it.
Yes.
If you buried someone there, you were responsible for their grave.
Yes.
Forever.
Yes, which is a problem.
Which was a big problem because it became, what do you call it, an arboretum? Because
pretty much, with everything that everybody was planting. But then you would have people not keeping up the graves because the families would die off. When you get to one child and then that child passes away as an adult, and they didn't have children, there's nobody left to take care of it.
Right.
So it did become, problematic. Then, of course, the Civil War became another problem for it.
And the main battle of the Civil War fought here came right up those streets.
Yes, it was heavily damaged in the Civil War.
Yeah.
And that was kind of what spurred the city to start looking for a new place as a burial ground for the city's dead. Originally, the city was looking at 1 to 2 miles outside of city limits. Now, at that time, State Street was city limits. So it was very small back then. And you think to yourself, well, State Street to Seminole Street, that is more than 1 to 2 miles. So a lot of people think, well, how to get that far outside of town? It was because there was a really good offer. That is what it amounts to. There was a really good offer.
80 cheap acres.
80 very inexpensive acres, you're right, that was suitable for cemetery grounds without a lot of prep ahead of time. Because there were offers, there were other places, but they may not have been suitable. They may have been too hilly, or there might have been a creek, or there was a lot of reasons on why they wouldn't
Woods and things.
Exactly, that they would have to do a lot more prep to. And the idea was they wanted to be able to go into this 80 acres, lay it out, get it open, so that the citizens could start using it as the city cemetery. Another kind of caveat to that is, why did they want it outside of city limits? And that you have to look actually outside of Springfield for that information. And it comes down to, there was a cemetery movement started in Paris way back when, in the earlier 1800s, 1830s, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, where it was this sanitary movement. Get the dead outside of the city. We don't want the dead making the living sick. And so as it jumped the pond and came over to America and started on the East Coast and moved west, it got to us around the 1850s, 1860s to put your cemeteries outside of city limits. And so when they found that 80 acres, they thought to themselves, city limits will never get this far.
Oh yeah.
I mean,
It was a long way. It was a full day to get out there and back.
Yes, it was. So, and then that became a problem for the people that were poor, that didn't own a horse or a carriage. They had to walk it, or they had to hire a coach to take them out there. And so that was some of the early problems of Hazelwood being out there. Just so people know, they did buy that 80-acre plot for $3,000. It was $37.50 an acre.
Oh my goodness.
What a great investment the city made.
I'd say so. I would say so.
But originally they were only looking for 40 acres.
Yeah.
So what did they do with it?
Well, they divided it up.
They divided it up a little bit. So just to kind of backtrack, that was in 1867 that the city purchased that. That they started looking in early 1867, and they purchased it. well, they received the offer in June, and they purchased it in September, was the official purchase date.
And they bought it from?
Oh, they bought it from, I knew you were going to ask me this. I'm trying to think. Joseph and Martha Powell, which was related to the Wood family. That Mrs. Powell was a Wood daughter.
Right.
And the Wood family was a very prominent family
Right.
at that time.
Had the hardware and all kinds. They had a hardware store on the square, and yeah.
Yes, yes. And so they were some of the first buyers in Hazelwood Cemetery also. So not only did they sell the land, but then all of the Wood family pretty much bought lots in Hazelwood early on. So we still have active lots in there.
Well, now, they bought this land, but yet they got the old cemetery.
Exactly.
Now what?
Well, first, before they even bought the land, they actually made a sale of cemetery lots before they bought the land. They agreed with the U.S. government for 5 acres to be sold for National Cemetery before they had even signed the official deed and made the payment. So no matter where the cemetery went, 5 acres was going to be sold off to the U.S. government for a Union cemetery.
Right.
So that was first. Now, what you end up having happen is they dedicate the cemetery in October of 1867. It opens for business around June of 1868. But people are still utilizing the damaged cemetery and the overgrown cemetery and that. And so you're having this problem that starts existing of whether or not the old city cemetery is going to be maintained anymore. And again, like you said, it was the families that were supposed to be maintaining it, but there was a problem with that, and they weren't maintaining it. And so eventually, that cemetery ends up being closed. And they tell the citizens the cemetery is closed, there's no longer burials in it. Unfortunately, citizens didn't listen. Imagine that.
Yeah.
And so they actually had to pass a city ordinance making it a misdemeanor to bury bodies in the old city cemetery. And so later on, because as we all know, it's no longer there.
Yeah.
The cemetery does not exist
And
there
it's
anymore.
right in the path of the growth of the community. I mean, the city is
exactly.
moving south at a high rate of speed.
It is, very much so. And so they end up eventually telling the citizens through the newspapers, hey, if you want to have your family members moved, please have them moved. If you don't do it by a certain date, we are going to go ahead and move them to Hazelwood Cemetery.
And they're going to Potter's Field. Pretty much.
It is a potter's field, kind of,
Yeah.
but kind of not at the
But
same time.
this is the time period when Lewis Tutt
Yes,
moves Davis Tutt's body
yes, to Maple Park.
to Maple Park. Yeah.
Yes, because they had opened a few years before that move. So the time frame in which they start telling the families to move the bodies was in the 1880s. And so they did that. Let's see. Let me see if I have a fact here on it or not. In 1881 is when they gave the notice. And you had to have the bodies moved by April 1st, 1882. And Lewis Tutt was quick on that one to have his brother moved.
Yeah.
And that was his half-brother.
Half-brother, right.
Yes, yes. So he was very quick to have him moved. And Lewis and his wife and their son, Davy, also are in that same burial plot
Right.
over at Maple Park.
That's what started the confusion about Davis Tutt's name.
Yes.
Is because they put the son David died of cholera while he was away at college. And when they brought him back and buried him there, they put a stone over his body that said David Tutt.
Yes.
And everyone thought that was Davis Tutt's body there. Yeah. And so they got the confusion about whether his name was David or Davis.
Well, but that also goes back to even in the coroner's report, it was David Tutt. Mm-hmm. And so was maybe the nephew named after the uncle?
Yeah.
Because he was deceased before the nephew was born.
Right.
So, or shortly around that time.
Yeah, anyway.
So, yeah. So a lot of families did end up moving their loved ones either to Maple Park, to Hazelwood. I believe I've seen some records of some going out to Ash Grove. The families had moved outside of city limits and were out towards Ash Grove. And then also, and forgive me, I'm going to forget the name of it, out towards Stratford, the historic cemetery out that way. Cannot think of the name of it. But anyways, so they moved the bodies. And then what was left over, the city paid to have moved to Hazelwood. And They thought. They did their best. It was not the city that actually did the moving. It was, I believe, a land developer.
Yeah, they contracted with a man.
They contracted it, yes.
To move the bodies.
To move the bodies. And the majority got moved. But we know that from newspapers, there were some that were missed. And, you didn't have a sexton of the cemetery keeping records. The families buried in there, and they kind of claimed their own little plots. And so if there was never a marker, there was no way to know that there was somebody buried there.
Until they were digging a basement or a new sewer line.
A new gas line.
Or whatever.
Expanding Campbell. So several times. And my understanding is every time that they found, even if it was just like a finger bone or casket hardware, any of that kind of stuff, it was brought out and put in that same section of Hazelwood Cemetery.
Right.
That way, it's at least close to the body.
Right.
If it was just a part, not to get morbid, but and there was some whole bodies moved out there too that were found later on. So there's been several times that it's been added to.
Now we talk about Hazelwood.
Yes.
Where did it get the name Hazelwood?
Well, that has an interesting story. I have been told several different stories. And the first one that I debunked was that it was because of the Woods family, being that the daughter, had sold the property, and the Hazeltine family. But the Hazeltines weren't here yet. So that was easy to kind of figure out that had nothing to do with it. Is the Woods family part of the Wood name? Possibly. But where did the Hazel come from? So the only thing in our records is that the mayor at the time said it would be known as Hazelwood.
Just
And that's simply it.
He just named it.
That's all my records say, is the mayor said it will be called Hazelwood.
That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
And so I went on kind of okay, why would he pick this? And my first thought was, where is he from? And so I figured out, first of all, what his names were, because we only had initials. It was R.B. Owen. Where was R.B. from? What was R.B.'s name? So I figured out that his name is Richard Bentley Owen, and he is from North Carolina. And I looked in North Carolina. He is not from a Hazelwood. There's no cemetery named Hazelwood near there. So that was my first thoughts. So that was a bust. Now, he did live in Missouri for 3 years before he moved to Springfield. So maybe he lived in a Hazelwood, Missouri? That's my next guess. Otherwise, I have no clue.
Okay.
Which I hate not having a clue.
Yeah, no,
It's terrible.
You've got to come up with some kind of answer.
Got to come up with a better story, don't I?
Yeah, you do.
But RB was only mayor for 1 year. He was very civic-minded and very active in the community while he was here. But at that time, we were having basically the mayor served for 1 year, and then they were up for re-election again. And so that kind of made things a little crazy.
Yeah, I'd say so.
So, but he is buried in Hazelwood.
Well, that's perfect. That's handy. So we're not sure exactly how it was named. It was initially a segregated cemetery, right?
Yes, it was originally 2 cemeteries, Hazelwood and Hazelwood South, or South Hazelwood, sorry.
Right. And South Hazelwood was where the African American families were buried.
They used at the time the term colored,
Right.
and then they used the term white.
Right.
So I believe it was more than just African Americans, perhaps.
Okay.
So anybody that was not white.
Yeah. And you can the line of demarcation of that is where the concrete fence stops and the chain link fence begins.
Yes, at 13th Street.
Yeah.
Yes. And then over to Center Street.
Yeah, okay. So that kind of defines that, and it remained that way until?
I knew you were going to ask this, and I didn't have that date ready. until segregation ended. I think we might have desegregated slightly before segregation ended, but I did not look up that fact yet. I'm still learning. 8 months.
Yeah,
I've only been there 8 months.
We'll have you back to
Okay.
bring along other details. Or, as this thing came into being, they bought this 80 acres. They immediately began to parcel it off.
They did. So they initially said that there would be 10 acres for the black families, or at the time they used the term colored. That would be 10 acres set aside for them. There was going to be 40 acres set aside for the main Hazelwood. So you have South Hazelwood, 10 acres, Hazelwood, 40 acres. But they were only going to plat out 23 acres to begin with because they knew that they would grow over time.
Mm-hmm.
They sold 5 acres to the U.S. government for the creation of the National Cemetery. And then they sold 5 acres shortly after to the Confederate Cemetery Association for the Confederate Cemetery. And then a couple decades later, they sold off a small portion to the Temple Israel Association, which was our Jewish association that was here. So there was 5 cemeteries.
Right. And so the 5 acres that they sold to the federal government,
Yes.
the national, is that all? They sold more after that then, didn't they?
That was piecemealed together in several transactions. So as soon as the Confederates bought, and actually I made a mistake. Confederates initially only bought 3 acres.
I was going to say they bought
3
less
acres.
than 5.
Then the federal government turned around and bought almost 2 acres. The Confederates bought a little bit more. So they kind of piecemealed together their 2 cemeteries, and then eventually in the
Not together. There was a stone wall between them.
Yes, in the 19 teens, that is when the federal government combined the Confederate Cemetery with the National Cemetery, and it became one.
That's when they opened up the wall.
That is when they opened up the wall to where you could go back and forth between the 2. And then in the 50s, Hazelwood combined from South Hazelwood and Hazelwood just into Hazelwood. So now there's 3 cemeteries in that 80 acres today.
Okay. And it's convoluted the way the entrances are.
It is.
That's a good word, John.
Why is that?
The entrances have been in many places over the years.
Yeah.
I just yesterday learned that there was an entrance on the west side of the cemetery at one point, and I had no clue about that one. Early on, they had an offer from a gentleman who offered up 30 feet of his property to build the road
An
that is
easement,
now,
sure.
an easement, which is now Seminole, part of Seminole. If they would move the entrance from the west side of the cemetery to the north side so that he wouldn't have to build a separate fence for his eastern edge of his property, which of course now is all neighborhoods. Because
Yeah.
Hazelwood backs up to a row of houses.
Right.
And so the entrance was over there. Now where on that west side, I'm not exactly sure. My guess would be 10th Street, because that seems to be that's one of the main streets. 10th and Center is the center of the cemetery.
Right.
And so I believe it's probably off 10th Street would be my best guess. We do know that at one point there was an entrance over off of Glenstone as well.
Right.
And then we have our newest entrance on Sunset, which was put in a few years ago.
Yeah. The Sunset wasn't there.
No.
It was a little dirt track, and then there was,
Yes.
to keep people from driving through there, they built this big hump of dirt right there about where the entrance is into them. That now.
Yeah.
Well, there was a south entrance at one point too, because I actually found records where the sexton of the cemetery wanted the south entrance closed, and it moved to the east side of the cemetery. So there's been entrances on
Yeah.
all 4 sides at different points in time.
Has the little house where you reside, has that always been down there?
So the small red brick building that you can see as you're driving down
Little house
Glenstone?
on the prairie, yeah.
Yes. No, that was built in the 50s. So there was a sexton's house that is in the section that's now owned by the National Cemetery, right there off Seminole when you would come in what is our our
Right.
old main entrance. There was a sexton's house there at one point. And there was another house a little bit further down in the cemetery as well.
Huh.
So there was two houses at
Yeah, I
different
was
points
wondering
in
about
time.
that, if it was always back off down there in the corner.
Nope. Nope. You would think it probably would have been, but no, there was some bathrooms there at one point before they actually put in the office building.
Okay, too much information.
We all need bathrooms
Yeah, well,
sometime.
that's-
All right,
So-
and you're talking about 10th Street and Center Street. You're talking about the streets in the
Inside the
cemetery.
cemetery.
Inside the cemetery.
Yeah,
So the streets inside the cemetery, they are named, First Street no longer exists because that got sold off to the federal government.
Right.
So we have 2nd through 18th Street.
And they're east and west, north and south. They're north
They
and south.
run,
North
they
and
run
south.
east and west.
East and west, okay.
Yes, our north to south streets, we have center, which is, of course, the center of the cemetery. And then going east, you have A east, B east, B east,
DGB?
C east, and it goes up to F east. And then
okay.
going to the west, you also have up to F.
Yeah.
So it's very laid out.
Well, it's
Right.
easy
And-
for people to find. You can say, 10th and Center.
Yes,
And
exactly.
Maple
Exactly.
Park's not like that.
No.
Maple Park does not have street names at all. Now, they tried to develop street names, but they have not.
Kirby Street and.
Yeah.
It's
and
Curvy
Crooked
Street and U-shaped Street,
Yeah.
but that has its own character to it.
Well,
So
it
you got to
does, it
love it,
does,
you
yeah,
know.
yeah.
Now Hazelwood did have some diagonal drives at one point, and we still currently have one diagonal drive that's not labeled. It's not named. It runs from A west at 9th Street to D west at 7th Street. And so there was actually 4, we like to kind of call them axial drives because they
Yeah.
came out of the center of
Oh,
the
okay,
cemetery
yeah,
at a
yeah,
diagonal.
Yeah.
All but one of them, just one is paved, one is completely grass. 2 of them have been either completely vacated and then sold off as cemetery lots or partially vacated and sold off as cemetery lots over the years. So there was a different design at one point.
So how close is the cemetery to being full?
We still have lots available for sale. We've got a doubles area, we've got a triples area. We're also working on getting a master plan done on how best to utilize the land that we have left. We have some undeveloped area of the cemetery as well. So some exciting news today is that we had our bids close at 3 o'clock today. And right before I came here, I learned that we had some bids that were put in. So we were progressed through that process of potentially selecting a company that will give us a master plan, tell us maybe how best to utilize what land we have left, and some other key pieces of cemetery operations that we're looking for.
That'll be good.
Yes,
That'll be good.
so we are knee deep in that
Yeah.
process.
How close do you coordinate with like the National Cemetery people?
I like to go over and harass Josh every once in a while, and he likes to come over and harass me every once in a while. As veterans, that's what we do.
Oh, okay.
So, I mean, it happens. But no, there's not really a whole lot of coordination that goes on. He did come over and check with us about a small piece of property the other day that kind of sits, we're not using part of it and they're not using part of it, and there's a fence line between the two parts. And so we were kind of discussing what could possibly happen with that in the future. We talked to him about if we replace our maintenance building, which is in need of it, if we could potentially maybe store some equipment over there so that we're not hauling it in and out of the cemetery every day.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there is some coordination, but it's not like we speak on a daily basis.
Right.
But we also aren't opposed to working together either.
Okay.
So, I mean,
That's
we're right
cool.
there next door. When we have something happen, we let them know. When they have something happen, they let us know. We kind of keep each other in the loop on
Okay,
things.
cool.